I'm really pleased to introduce Wayne Karlin, who served in the U.S. Marine Corps and was awarded the Viet Nam Service Medal, the Air Medal, the Presidential Unit Citation, and the Combat Air Crew Badge with 3 stars. Wayne has published 3 works of nonfiction and 8 novels for which he's won numerous awards and fellowships. His newest collection of short stories is Memorial Days, Viet Nam Stories from 1973 to 2022. Wayne, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this special Ali and Fall for the Book event. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm honored and thrilled to be here. It's a kind of dark, gloomy day where I am in Southern Maryland, so that's why I'm in dramatic half darkness here. But anyway, it's a dark subject, so I guess it's fitting. I started writing when I returned from the Vietnam War. There was a book called Free Fire Zone of stories by Vietnam veterans that I co-edited with Hazel Paquette, who might be here in the audience today also, and Larry Rotman. I've written books about other subjects, books set in Europe, the Middle Ages, Middle East. But the subtitle of Memorial Days is Viet Nam Stories, meaning limited to that subject. And if you look at my earliest stories in the book, published right after the war, they're about the war. But I was never really interested in continuing to write war stories about combat. Wars have their endings and families, wrote the sociologist Cynthia Enroe in a quote that's used as an epigraph in a great book by Karen Turner and Fenton Howe called Even the Women Must Fight. And many of the stories in Memorial Day published from the, I'd say from the 1990s on, have to do with what's happened to the generations affected by the war, both in contemporary Vietnam and here. Especially cross-generational trauma, the way the damage of war and even the seductiveness of war is passed down from one generation to another. Some of those stories were inspired by veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan I found sitting in my community college classes. Some of them were the sons and daughters of Vietnam veterans, all of them going through the same things that we experienced coming back from Vietnam. I wrote this in the introduction to the book. The idea for this literary retrospective came to me as a result of another kind of out-of-control retrospective in the form of thoughts, emotions, images, and dreams I thought safely lidded in the box of my past. I'd written all about that, therefore it should be over. When I came back from the Vietnam War over 50 years ago, I began writing because I thought I was good at it, because I didn't want to talk about the war, and because I felt I owed it to the dead and to the living who might become the next dead. And also because it was, as all writing is, an attempt to control, to impose a grid of narrative and meaning on the uncontrollable. And over the last 2 years, perhaps because of the grief of other losses, perhaps because of my age, perhaps because of the age itself, which has kept trotting out versions of my war identical in all ways except for time and geography, it all began leaking out of that box. And I had to learn again the old lesson that some things are never over. So it's a book of war stories, though mostly they're after-war stories, fictional imaginings. Who needs that? What earthly good can that do? My friend, the poet Bill Earhart, gives one reason why when he says, I will have no other choice. And I'm going to do some of the introduction at this point with some, some visual aids. So let me get that up. And this is Bill's poem, Guns, where that line comes from. Again, we passed that field, green artillery piece, squatting by the Legion post, on Shelton Avenue, its ugly little pointed snout ranged against my daughter's school. Did you ever use a gun like that? My daughter asks. And I say, no, but others did. I used a smaller gun, a rifle. She knows I've been to war. That's dumb, she says. And I say, yes, and not, because it was. And not again, because she doesn't know. How do you tell a 4-year-old what steel can do to flesh? How vivid do you dare to get? How explain a world where men kill other men deliberately and call it love of country? Just 18, I killed a 10-year-old. I didn't know. He spins across the marketplace, all shattered chest, all eyes and arms. Do I tell her that? Not yet. Though one day I will have no choice except to tell her or to send her into the world wide-eyed and ignorant. The boy spins across the years till he lands in a heap, in another war, in another place, where yet another generation is rudely about to discover what their fathers never told them. When I taught at the community college, I'd always start my intro to literature courses by having them introduce themselves and telling me what their majors were. You know, it's usually computer science or nursing or business, law. Most of them were not English majors. They were there because it was a required course. So I'd ask them why they thought that was, why it was required. What are they going to get out of it besides 3 credits and possibly a passing grade? I love this quote from Cynthia Butler about writing. And it's also something that tells you about what you can get from reading a story, and which I want this presentation to be about. So Butler, every story I create creates me. I write to create myself. Every story I read creates me. I read to create myself. Every story I write adds to me a little, changes me a little, forces me to re-examine an attitude or belief, causes me to research and learn, helps me to understand people and grow. Every story I read adds, and so on. So I'm going to start also with this quote from Tim O'Brien: "Stories save lives." That kind of play with words is something O'Brien loves to do in his writing. You think of the different meanings the word "save" can have. I mean, to rescue, collect, money, preserve. In that particular story, it comes from Lives of the Dead. The word can mean the way we preserve the memory of the departed by telling stories about them. Preserve, collect, rescue. People also speak of saving souls in the sense of salvation, which can be a religious term, but not always. Can it also mean saving ourselves? Can stories save us? Fictional narratives. Can fictional narratives save us? Something made up. Can these made up worlds save anyone? So in doing this presentation, I want to center it on that question, same question I'd ask my students. In past readings from this book, I centered on the stories set in present time, the stories of how the Vietnam War has bled into subsequent generations. But today I'm gonna read from parts of a story that's set in the war, but written decades later. And I'm going to tell you something of the origin of that imagined story, because in a way it's a story which is about the power of stories. Here I am, unrecognizable. Deadly accoutrements of war are all around me. The machine gun and the rifle with the magazine in it, and the K-bar knife and the magazines with the rounds in them. The war is all around me, but I've shed it. I'm shirtless. My hands is on a book, and my eyes are on its pages. The war is all around me, but I'm elsewhere. There's no frigate like a book to take us lands away, wrote Emily Dickinson. I don't know what land I'm in there, but it's not Vietnam, the war. I don't remember what I was reading. It might have been something purely for escape. one of those, thankfully forgotten schlocky bestsellers of those days, Harold Robbins or something. Or it could have been science fiction, some good Heinlein or good Asimov. It could have been a book about another war, Battle Cry by Leon Uris, a World War II novel that had been one of the reasons that seduced me into the Marine Corps. I might have been rereading it to situate myself in the context of a similar yet very different experience, one I was starting to question, one whose moral complications I was starting to question. It might have been some of the Jack London stories I'd loved. I'd loved them in high school. I named my first dog Buck after my last dog also, actually, after the London stories. And they exhilarated me, speaking of Buck, with that, the possibility, how's the world look through the mind of a dog? Boy, you could do that in your imagination. That was great. It might have been one of London's darker works, Seawolf, with that predatory captain, Wolf Larson, who I connected to my drill instructor. Might have been James Jones' From Here to Eternity, a novel that allowed me to understand the eternal chicken shit of military life, relating to and growing from the way his characters lost themselves or were able to save themselves. It may have been a book like Jones' fiction, gave me situations and characters that I can internalize, help me see how to find and save the self that I wanted to be. Steinbeck's Tom Joad, moving out of the dust, Hemingway's Robert Jordan, ready to sacrifice himself for a better humanity, or maybe a Farewell to Arms, about mentally and morally choosing to leave a war, much more like the one I was in. I don't say I was thinking about all that at the moment, but one way or another, subconsciously, those books were working on me, shifting the way I perceived the world. So, yeah, I might have been reading Hemingway or James Jones or London's The Seawolf or Steinbeck, the books I carried with me and into the war. Some 50 or so kilometers away, deep in the jungle, over to the side of the pathways that we called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and that our enemies in the North Vietnamese army called the Trung Sung Trails. A 16-year-old girl named Lê Minh Quay may also have been reading Hemingway or Steinbeck or London. Unlike myself, who had no access to any writings by Vietnamese authors, she carried those translations of American novels and stories on her back, in her rucksack. Quay was a member of the Volunteer Youth Brigade in the enemy army. Reading the American writers, they're the ones approved by the party, sometimes brought her teasing by the other girls. Her living conditions and her duties and those of the other girls were dirty and dangerous. The hidden trails in the thick snake and insect and sometimes tiger-infested jungle they lived in were used to bring soldiers and weapons and ammunition south to the war. The Americans who were not in her book shelled and bombed them when they could discover the trails or estimate where they were. The girls' job was to keep operative whatever section of the trail they were assigned to. They did that often while under attack by filling in any of the craters bombs may have made and by exploding or defusing the bombs that didn't explode. Many of them died that way. They also helped guide the soldiers south along their section of the trail, sometimes lining the way in white shirts to act like a living curb, because the trucks would, at night would not be able to drive with their headlights on because they might be spotted. They'd also build coffins and bury the dead. Quay did this work from the time she was 15 to the time she was 19. One of the ways she sustained herself was by her reading. She hated the enemy, the Americans, yet their stories, as well as the Vietnamese literature she loved and read, gave her ways of finding courage, of finding strength in herself. But the American stories did something else as well. They helped her still see how her own humanity was reflected in them, in the terrible enemy, the others. Reading American stories during the war had sustained her in much the same way they had me. But in reading those from the other side, it gave her something I lacked. It also helped preserve her humanity. It's not the most effective way to be a warrior, but it is the way to maintain your own humanity. The writer Ian McEwan said it best, I think. Imagining what it's like to be someone other than oneself is at the core of our humanity. It is the essence of compassion, and it is the beginning of morality. After the war, Lê Minh Quế became a writer, and today she's one of Vietnam's most well-known novelists, short story writers. I first met her at a program held by the Joyner Center at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, which brought together American and Vietnamese writers who've been combatants on the opposite sides of the war. We gave presentations, did writing workshops for veterans and others, but mainly for a month or more, we lived together. And there usually came a time during that period when we'd ask each other, where were you and when were you? And, it's as if we were trying to ascertain if we had ever been at a time and at a place where we would have tried to kill each other. That question came up one morning when I was sitting at the breakfast table with Lê Minh Quế and found that at times when I was a helicopter gunner, I had flown over some of the places she had been when she would have been there. I described it this way. She had been a target and threat to me, the ghost under the canopy of leaves, and I'd been monstrous and mechanical to her, the sky elementally reconfigured into noise and terror. Now we could suddenly see each other's faces. It was an instant when everything came together, not just because of where we had been in the war, but because we had both become writers after it. We understood that that moment when our stories had wrapped together had embodied the latent power of stories to save our own hearts by allowing us into the stories of other human beings. As a result of our friendship, we ended up with Trung Vu, another editor who had been on the other Vietnamese side of the war, creating an anthology of stories by Vietnamese and American combatants called The Other Side of Heaven. As we got to know each other and became friends, not just in that conference, but over the years on many visits I made to Vietnam, Quế shared more of her experience with me. Once she mentioned how she and the other girls had spied on some Americans they'd seen bathing. There was a peeping Tom aspect and a teenage anatomical curiosity about it, but what had struck her the most was seeing those boys unshelled, lightened from helmets and flak jackets and weapons, all the things that made them into the configuration of enemy. It made them human, and she had to confront the complications of that, complications that are in fact what make us human, and that I think the best stories reveal. There are those who think that we can only write about people who are like ourselves from our own backgrounds and so on. And I think that negates some of the power of fiction to do exactly that. So I want to concentrate on the one story, in a story called The American Reader, which is what the other girls had called Quế, sometimes bitterly even, during the war. And it's, in a way, it is a story about stories about how they can save our humanity by putting us into the lives of other human beings with whom we may not seem on the surface to have anything in common, who even in fact may be trying to kill us, or how refusing to know the stories of the other can make it easier to lose our humanity, making it easier even to kill them, and in the process, kill our better versions of ourselves. So I'm gonna read from that story, and then at the end of it, I want to come back to this slideshow. I want to read two poems that I think will tie everything together, and then we can go into a discussion. So bear with me while I tell you a story. It's the American reader. The first time Dorothy Calm sees Americans, they are bathing in a stream about 1,000 meters from where she and two of her girlfriends lay watching through the foliage. The soldiers' voices don't carry that far, though she can see they are splashing, probably laughing, their skin occasionally flashing like daylight through the leaves. She wishes she could get closer. She wants to see them, these enemies, translated into flesh from the tattered Steinbecks and Hemingways in London she carries in her rucksack. Sometimes, after a bombing or strafing, the other girls would look at Calm with bitter astonishment, the American reader, yet always a wistfulness in their teasing as well, as if what Calm is holding on to is something they can't name, but feel sliding out of themselves day by day. She strains now to see the Americans through the screen of leaves. They are torn apart in her mind, and she needs to knit them together if she's going to knit herself together. They are still Tom Joad, moving through a vision of a vision of a perfected, kind world, as she, when she remembers, imagines herself doing, moving through the dust of a space she finds unimaginable in the closeness of the jungle, even though the Americans seem now to be trying to turn that jungle, these trees, into that same bowl of dust and emptiness Joad had fled to a greener land. They are a man trying with his hands to build a fire as the circle of howling wolves closed in on him, as her own hands, her fingers, worked frantically to prevent the fire blossoming from the guts of the bomb that moments before had howled down from them to her. They are the machines that come to kill her and hers. They are the red flashing of tracers through the jungle canopy, the masked, mirroring face hovering above, the sudden light shivering like panic through the branches. They are a weight in her rucksack, the books that anchor her. They give her paths she can follow along the path she must follow. They give her the courage to face themselves. They are these naked boys in a jungle pond, though they are too far away to really see anything. Her friend complains in a whisper, and the other two girls giggle. They are too far away to see anything, she thinks, because they are ghosts. They are lines in a book. There are too many contradictions to be real, to be flesh, to be naked. They are flying over Helicopter Valley with the cup wreckage below when the pilot's scream pierces the gunner's ears. A sound so filled with terror and despair that filters through the earphone static, he hears it as a wail spiraling up from the broken aircraft below them. The helicopter jerks up and then down. He traverses the ground with the barrel of his machine gun. He sees no tracers, has heard nothing hit the plane. He risks a glance over at the two prisoners they picked up at LZ Crow, drags the flashed after image of them quickly back to his stare out of the port. The recon Marine sitting across from them hasn't moved, his M14 on his lap, his finger on the triggers. The two in olive green North Vietnamese army uniforms, tattered, muddy, and bloody, but not faded. New guys, sitting motionless also, the base of a triangle, the recon Marine the apex, their eyes dulled, heads leaning towards each other, side by side, as if still fastened by the wire the nungs who had captured them had punctured through their cheeks. The Marine, he was a staff sergeant, had cursed and pulled it out when they'd been handed over, the two North Vietnamese soldiers jerking like fish as he did it. The holes in their cheeks, scabbed over now, but still bleeding red slick snail trails down their swollen cheeks. Tears from strange eyes. The staff sergeant's eyes dulled also, his head lilted. The noise from the cockpit, curses, scuffles, hasn't abated. Sam, the crew chief, keys his mic. Sir, what's happening? A fucking snake, the co-pilot Anderson says, his voice more exasperated than fearful. A snake, he says again indignantly, and the word, the hot, poisonous sibilance of it opens into everything, into the jagged carpet of smashed helicopters below them, into the impossible, malevolent steam bath of tangled, vine-strangled, insect-crawling, 100-foot tall, triple canopy jungle they're flying over again now, into the men they had set down into it and taken out, sucked dry like insects caught in a web, into landing too hot and too heavy and downwind on slopes picketed with trees, the heavy wet air pushing down the helicopter, loaded with its weight of flesh and equipment, all the deadly specific numbers, 13 grunts times 80 pounds each of steel helmets and M14s, web belts hung with grenades and loaded magazines and full canteens and machetes and flak jackets and field packs, and the 150 to 200 pound 18 to 20-year-old bodies carrying all of it. Not to mention the helicopter's own machine guns and ammunition and flak jacketed crew and 2,200 pounds of fuel, all optimal conditions needed to suck the lift right from under blades, to wind down as if it were the clock of your life, the RPM that kept you in the air, to stop rotor blades like a hand stuck into a fan, to feel yourself a gracefully floating dandelion suddenly puffed on from above by a malevolent hot breath giant. It's all there in those words, in the utterly appropriate hissed curse of them. The 12.7 millimeter North Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns and B-40 rockets and quad 50 machine guns that send orange and green fireballs streaking past the ports. And if that wasn't enough, there were the prisoners dragged in the rear ramp like fish flopping on a wire, and the wounded and dead you'd scooped out of the black, meat-grinding, fire-seared night. And just in case, by any chance, if that wasn't enough, as Vietnam would have it, to top it all, if that wasn't enough, then you could still have a fucking snake in your cockpit. She looks at her friends, Sung and Tu Ha, their faces shaded under the floppy green jungle hats, but scratched, smudged, hollow-cheeked with hunger, gums bleeding, teeth loose. If she could see their bodies under the clothes that hung like rags on them, she would see ribs pushing against paper-thin flesh over stomachs bloated with hunger, nets of scars and scratches, insect bites and scabies. They are all like that. She understands what bodies are. When bodies are laid out on the broken earth, they look like part of it. People go south dressed, and they come back dead. And that direction itself has come to mean death. And she helps bury them, the dead, though sometimes they are wounded, and sometimes she holds them, the way the woman in Steinbeck held a starving man against her breast and gave him suck, and they call her mother, though she's younger than them. And sometimes they are the other girls or boys from her unit, and often the bombs blast the clothing from their bodies, so they go into their deaths as they had come into their births. And she had at first, more than death itself, feared that exposure. But she's 17 now, and she knows that death makes everyone sexless. In a line of bodies, what caught your eyes was how little difference there was, how easily it could be erased. Her thoughts are scrambled, confused, mixed now with the dim white figures seen through the screen of leaves, the ghosts that would kill her. A fucking snake, Anderson says, and the gunner can feel it. Sense the snake moving under the deck plates, sneaking through the avionics, staying just ahead or just behind them. He glances down involuntarily, something to the left of his left foot. Green, brown. He looks at the staff sergeant. He still hasn't moved. Neither have the prisoners. The gunner carefully slides out his K-bar knife. It hasn't moved. Playing dead, he thinks. He stares. He should be looking out of his port. It's getting rapidly dark, but the enemy's here. It's too still, too dull, inanimate. Can't be a snake. He slowly advances the point of the knife, pushes down swiftly, like a snake striking. The object is solid, unsnake-like. He slowly squats, thinking, grenade, no, a small book. He picks it up. It doesn't explode. There's a black and white picture of a girl inside, a young Vietnamese couple in front of an iron gate. The writing on the stained pages is Vietnamese writing. Regular letters, tortured top and bottom of little barbed wire spikes. The written lines broken as if poetry. It probably belonged to one of the prisoners. You should give it to the sergeant. Snake's diary, he thinks. Viper's story. The two prisoner and the sergeant are still staring at each other, motionless as a diorama, as if all three have been wired together. The small book burns his hand through his flight glove. He straightens up, quickly tosses it out of his port, follows it with his machine gun barrel, twisting and fluttering in the air, white pages fluttering against the dark sky, the photos flying out like released spirits. It's growing dark and darker yet under the thick branches, canopied over the creek where she bathes. It's the same pool, a widening of the creek really, where the Americans had bathed. Com can hardly see the bank, knows she can't be seen. Suddenly the noise of rotors beats down on top of the leaves like fists beating on her door, and she freezes until it fades off, leaving only its echoes and then the memory of its echoes. She thinks, taking herself away from it, how she will make all this into story, mix has been with could be, fold a story over herself like a camouflage shelter as the bombs fall closer. This urgency to immerse herself in the same water, she thinks, to take the mystery of them into her skin, and her mind tries to flee the thought, but she has trained herself to clutch at those fugitives of her being. They were, in the end, the whispers that named her. She has a broken sliver of soap from a bar that Tu Ha brought back from Hanoi, a luxury, and she soaps herself, and now she hums a tune to an Italian song all the girls from Hanoi remember and sing. She has dirt under her nails from the trail, from the dirt they shoveled back into the craters, smoothing them for the trucks going south. And her fingers stink from the gelignite they'd packed around the bomb she had embraced earlier in the day, helped lower into a hole blown up. She scrubs her hands and her body at the words she feels written on her skin, seep through it. She is unable to see her flesh now, feels herself borderless, dissolving into the water, the darkness, the insect hum. The Americans she has seen that day come again into her mind, and she lets them float next to her for a moment and then lets them go. As the book falls, the helicopter formation wheels west over the mountains, over the mountainous jungle, a place filled with snakes. The darkness is not so much beginning to cover it as it is entering it, like an injected liquid. The top of the jungle canopy configuring into ominous fluid shapes, leaf people. Anderson's voice is in the gunner's ear again, his words repeated by the pilot. They want him and Sam to fire into the fleshy mass below, into the trees. They think something is down there. No shit. It's the snake's home, the place of snakes, the home of the snake and the land of the viper. He fires down into it. As he does, he sees an artillery barrage begin over to the west of their flight path, aircraft diving down as if called by his fire. A hot shell casing falls on his neck, stings like a snake bite. He fires more, his shoulders shaking, hands vibrating, fires at the ghosts moving under the trees, fires at a girl he imagines just as she tries to imagine his face behind the wind and the fire and the noise and the fragmented light. His rounds curve and streak down far from where she crouches, hidden, watching, and the darkling green absorbs them so quickly it is as if they never existed at all. And I'm gonna end that reading with two poems that I think carry that idea of seeing through the eyes of the other. my. This is from George Evans, who's a medic in Vietnam, and who was here today. And this note explains. This is a long poem. This is the ninth part of it, called "A Walk in the Garden of Heaven." The Garden of Heaven refers to Ten Shin En, the Japanese rock garden at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. The poet visited the garden with Vietnamese writers Miss Lê Minh Quay and Mr. Hu Ting, both veterans of the North Vietnamese Army, visiting the United States for the first time. George was with me when I met Lê Minh Quay. We stood in the garden and looked at the stone bridges connecting islands on the gravel ocean. I felt the war lift from us in flames, inch by inch, flowing into stone like a river on fire. We ended something walking together and started something. I've read the war is over for you, but I've never believed it. Victory is no balm for loss. Any of us may celebrate a moment, but we live a long time, and finality is not what we need. Compassion is what we need. Let the future think about the war being over, because then it will be. We can't afford to heal. If we do, we'll forget, and if we forget, it will start again. We've destroyed too much to be sentimental. We know that those above and those below the jungle canopy killed everything that got in the way, and we're all guilty of something. Wars are always lost, even if you win. And this poem is by the great poet and novelist Nguyen Phan Quay Mai, and she wrote it about her meeting with Bruce Weigel, who was also at Joyner when we met the Vietnamese writers. But this is when Quay Mai was with him in Vietnam, with a Vietnam veteran, or Bruce Weigel, another great poet. We sit opposite each other, a dewy curtain of hatred replaced by the smoke screen from two steaming bowls of pho. He sweats like a Vietnamese in the tropical heat. Like a Vietnamese, he raises his chopsticks. The war has never stopped. He has never forgotten the war, and each night he must survive his own dreams. He stays quiet, traffic noise making waves from all four sides, rocking us between present and past. He can't explain the reasons for the war, the reasons why my relatives had to fall, and why so many children are imprisoned in the pain of Agent Orange. If he told me, I would not be able to touch the funeral whiteness that has bleached his hair and carved into his features, sinking me deep into a bottomless, twirling tunnel. On a nearby TV screen, another war is alive. Only an arm's span away from us, death is opening its mouth, snatching and gobbling down lives. Only an arm's span away from us. Only an arm's span away. Nguyen Phan Quay Mai. Okay. Rather dark reading. That's where it is. So I'd like to open this for questions, comments, anything that you would like to say. And thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for George Mason and for the Ali Learning Center for hosting this. And I'm grateful to have you all as listeners. So I leave it open to you. Can I see a hand up there from Michael Archer, who is a let me introduce him. He's a veteran of the siege at Khe Sanh and a wonderful writer himself, writing books about that experience at Khe Sanh. And I see he has his hand up, so I'd like to have him as the first questioner. because I know it'll be kind to me also.
Hi, Wayne. Can you hear me?
Here you, Mike.
Yeah. I don't so much have a question, but I have to thank you for your work over the years. It led me to places that I didn't know I even had within me. But your reading of The American Reader, which was my favorite part of Memorial Days, and I'm glad you did it. Really tells me that as much as I try, and if this is probably a metaphor for the siege at Khe Sanh, but I have to keep digging deeper into this issue. I haven't even scratched the surface, and thank you for being my guide in more ways than one.
Well, Mike, I can say you're a mutual guide, and your books have meant the world to me. I urge everybody out there to get them and read them right away. But thank you so much, Mike, and yeah, let's keep going deeper.
Thank you.
Wayne, first of all, thank you. An incredibly powerful presentation, and I'm so grateful for what I always learn from listening to you and reading your wonderful works. I was pleased in some ways to hear you talking about Tim O'Brien's Story Saves Lives, because there are many ways that I think your work struggles with that. Like, what good have stories done? What good has the writing that I've done and others done? Trying to warn other people about what war really is, and has it done any good? And yet, what I think you said here, and you said before about how on close examination, stories can teach us better how to love. The stories about war can teach us on close examination the importance of listening, of love. I think your testimony today about what happened to you at Joyner is part of that. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that. Talk a little bit more about if indeed you do struggle with Tim O'Brien's statement that stories can save lives.
The struggle is, look around us at all the killing that's still going on, and that I mentioned that I had these guys in my classes coming back from the other wars, and knowing their parents had been in the Vietnam War, and we're looking now at the slaughter going on in Gaza, and so it's that question. I know that that they don't stop those things, but on the other hand, the hope is that they can save somebody. That somebody is going to read this and maybe be changed. And I guess the other part of it, Michael, is just whether they're effective or not. I really don't feel like there's any choice. If you're given this, I was blessed with some kind of ability with words. There's a lot of other stuff I can't do, but I was blessed with that, and that's an obligation also. So, what am I going to do with that? And the Vietnam War was probably the most forming part of the war, and then meeting the Vietnamese afterwards were the most formative periods of my life, and they're also the most formative, some of the most formative periods in the life of my country. So, they have to be written about, and that maybe somebody's going to read them, and it'll change somebody. That's the hope. Thanks for your question, Lynn.
I have a question from the chat from Daniel Kane.
Yeah.
He wants to know how the function of the Vietnam War in your stories is something that helps you cope with the aftermath of the war.
I don't look on my stories as being as their purpose being primarily therapeutic for myself. I can't say they don't have that effect, But it's also getting the stories out, but also fictionalizing them so that what I write about is a step away from me. You know, it might be based on real experiences like that story. Well, we never had a snake in the helicopter, but other, you know, that did happen in another helicopter, and I took it. But you know, taking stories based on that, but making up characters, putting them a step away from me. You know, I got to say that has been a help in dealing with the war. But I also don't want that to be its primary purpose. There's that line in George's poem, you know, we can't afford to heal. And so there has to be to write this stuff, I think, a constant wounding also. And that's, you know, that's art. I mean, that's a price of it. So I hope that wasn't too complicated an answer, but it's a complicated reaction.
Mhm. I have another question from Matt. He asks, can you speak more on how you read while serving in the Vietnam War? What those days looked like, or rather felt like, your memories of those times?
Well, yeah, I tried to I guess get that into my introduction to this. I mean, I didn't think of all those things when I was reading. I brought books with me, and I've always been a reader. And you know, and in a way, like, you know, as I said with Layman Quay, they saved me, both because sometimes they were escapes, and just because sometimes they helped me to put together or start to put together some of the moral complications that I was feeling. And I think there was a kind of an arc in the writers that I read. You know, I talked about the more escape books, going to the more books that I would call literature. I mean, I went through that arc in my reading. You know, some of the books that I had with me, some that I could get from other places, you know, borrow from other people and so on. And you know, the more I was there, the less the escape stuff just appealed to me. I mean, because I needed to deal with things that were pretty morally complicated, and those writers, you know, helped me to do that.
I'm going to follow up with another question, which is, you said you brought books with you. Were books ever shipped over to you?
There was a program that the USO had, you know, that books were donated by people, like people donate books to hospitals.
Mhm.
I don't recall ever having access to that. But you know, there were, you know, people brought books.
Mm.
I mean, a lot in my generation read,
Mhm.
which I'm happy to say. So we, you know, we would exchange books, and there were always books available, you know, someplace or other in a base camp.
Mm.
But yeah, there was a program that the USO did with that. Just never got to take advantage of it.
Thank you. You'll remember back in the fall on Veterans Day, I had a film screening of my documentary, Just Like Me.
Yeah.
And I had contacted you and asked for your permission to, in my introductory remarks, read your poem, Drinking with the Enemy.
Mhm.
And there's a line in there that really struck me, which was a very simple line, and I'll paraphrase. You're sitting with a group of Vietnamese veterans. I'm sure at least some of, maybe all of them were.
They all were. Yeah.
And one of them said, "You bombed our church." And he laughed and said, "It still doesn't have a roof." And I thought that meant a lot to me in my work, and that the Vietnamese, as Layman Quay has said in your comments, a different kind of they moved forward in a different way than we did. And I wonder if you can use that comment about that meeting to talk a little bit more about the attitudes of those that you've met on your return trips.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I mean, that reaction from my memory of that incident, you know, the laugh, us, it still doesn't have a roof. Um, one of the things that I think a lot of us enabled a lot of us to be close with the veterans of the other side was sharing that kind of Black humor, for one thing. But for another thing, it's an indication of this is in the past and it's going to be built, and we're going to build it. And I can sit here with you and I can laugh about this now, and you were, that's your country, you were part of that bombed that church, and I can sit and drink with you here, and I can laugh about that fact, and we all share that way of laughing about the darkest things, because I'm dealing with it, and it's going to be built, and also I'm putting a little of that on you because you're sitting here. I don't have to mention about the roof not being there, but I'm putting a little bit of that on you, and that's okay too. That's okay too. So yeah, I mean that it's some of the most healing parts of all our journeys, I think. Those of us who have met with the Vietnamese, and seeing their strength, and seeing the way that they can not put it behind them, but incorporate it, learn from it, and move. Know that this is where they have to move from and move on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any opinion regarding Americans still not being able to get beyond the Civil War outcome? Well,
that's an analogy I've used, because the Vietnam War was in large part a civil war between the two Vietnamese sides, and there's more healing that needs to be done between the Vietnamese who had been on both sides of the war than happens between the Americans and the Vietnamese. It's in a lot of ways, but easier for us than it's easier for one side to forgive the other side and to move on. And that's both. I mean, when Lê Minh Quê and I and Hoang Tai did a book tour with the Other Side of Heaven anthology, we found we had people from the Southern Vietnamese side in the book, writers, but still whenever we went to a place, there'd be demonstrations by the older people in that community against the idea of having writers from communist Vietnam in the book. And they were very volatile, and there were people in Vietnam. Lê Minh Quê got in some trouble for including writers from the other, not the Americans, but writers from the other Vietnamese side of the war. So my response to that was, it's a roundabout way to get to this question. My response to that was, yeah, the Vietnamese are that's still something that they're dealing with. That's still something we're dealing with from our own Civil War, and that we have not completely healed as a country, because the issues of that war and the issues that caused that war are still issues that are very much alive. The issues of racism and so on are still very much alive in our country. So yeah, no, the Civil War in ways is not over.
There is another question from David Kubrick, who starts out by saying, thanks, Mr. Karlin, for your good writing. I suppose you're familiar with Jeanette Rankin's comment, winning a war is like winning an earthquake.
I wasn't, but thank you for that.